we found him, lying face down," said Emmy, still breathless from running for the doctor. "He was bleeding from his chest." "He might have punctured his chest on the rock when he fell," Mangle suggested. "Let's see," the doctor said. He lifted Ben's shirt to inspect his chest. "I don't know what to tell you, but there's no wound on his chest either. I can't see any place where the blood would have come from." Clarence heaved a sigh of relief. "Praise be," he shouted. "He must have tripped and knocked himself out when he fell. I didn't shoot you after all, son. Maybe my aim is improving." Ben smiled and said, "Well, that would be a miracle." Emmy scowled. "But there was blood all over him," she said. "Where did it come from?" Ben looked at the front of his shirt, then stuck his pinky finger through the hole the size of a bullet in the exact same spot as the hole in the back of his shirt. As they all crowded around inspecting Ben, Johnny discreetly removed the cloth from Warner's coat and put it inside his jacket, zipping it in. Clarence looked into his son's eyes. "Boy, you're right," Clarence said. "I believe we have witnessed a miracle." Mangle stood up and looked straight at Johnny. "Ja," he said, "I believe we have." Just then, Deputy Mueller entered the clearing and took a deep breath. "Well," he drawled, "looks like somebody's got some explaining to do." Chapter 20. Professor Mangle was right. Deputy Miller did shut down the moonshine operation. He confiscated the still and the rifle and had them tear down the lean-to. But he didn't arrest anyone, partly because of Mangle's story and partly because there was no point. "Nobody appears to have been shot," he said, "and this county may be dry, but the next one over isn't." Professor Mangle accepted full responsibility. So the deputy did take him to the sheriff's station to make a statement. Mr. Warner headed back to his drugstore, mourning the loss of the still. "'Tain't right," he muttered. "Just ain't right." Ben was still a bit dazed by all of what happened, but not so much that he couldn't suppress a laugh. "Pops leave it to you to hide a still inside a coffin," he said. Father and son both threw back their heads and busted out in laughter. "I don't get what's so funny," Johnny said. I don't expect I've told you about my Grams," Ben answered. That woman was a bona fide hero," Clarence said. "What did she do?" Emmy answered. "She was the one on her plantation to escape. She was the first one on her plantation to escape," Ben explained. "Others tried, but none of them made it, except Grams. Got all the way to Canada, and the route she took was along the Underground Railroad," Emmy exclaimed. "Right," Clarence said, nodding. "My mama was a brave woman. She went on to help a lot of others find their way to freedom too. So as a way of remembering her, I wander up and down the route she took, imagining all the things she went through to get herself and them others free." "But I still don't get why you thought it was so funny," Johnny said. A big grin stretched over Ben's face. "Well, you know that the leader of the Underground Railroad was..." "Levi Coffin," Emmy interrupted again. Right. But what you don't know is that the name of the man Levi worked alongside of the man known as the founder of the Underground Railroad was William Still. Clarence laughed again. No one can say as I ain't got me a sense of humor. Father and son laughed as they made their way to Ben's home. Johnny and Emmy were both stunned as they walked home. What in the world just happened? Emmy asked before she went inside her house. I don't know, Johnny replied, shaking his head. I really don't know. Emmy shook her head as she opened the door and disappeared inside. Johnny crossed his yard to the shed. He went in and emptied his bag on the workbench. He replaced the tools and unfurled the cloth. It was spotless. This is so strange, Johnny thought. Why did the cloth heal Macduff and Ben but not Steve? Or did it actually kill anyone? Maybe the hole in Ben's shirt had already been there. Or perhaps a stick or a rock had made it when he fell. But why did he fall when Clarence fired the gun if he hadn't been hit? And why was there no blood on the cloth? It just didn't add up. Johnny's mind was a complete jumble. He couldn't think straight, and he was exhausted from the afternoon's events and from the lack of sleep. He folded the cloth and started to take it back inside when he saw his father step out of the house. Johnny ducked back inside the shed. There was no way for him to go in without being seen by his father, and he knew that if he tried to sneak the cloth into the house, his father would find it and confiscate it. He could think of only one thing to do. He rolled it up and stuffed it into a small gap between the workbench and the shed wall, then snatched some boards over the stashed some boards over the gap. Then he grabbed his bag, exited the shed, and headed for the house. His father met him halfway. Have fun at Emmy's? Harold asked. Johnny took a deep breath. No, he said. You probably know I didn't have dinner there. Harold nodded. Yes, I know. I just got the strangest call from Deputy Miller and Carl Mangle, who were both at the sheriff's station. Johnny exhaled slowly. I just wanted to finish my lightning experiment. And then we saw Ben, and things happened. Why isn't he livid? Johnny wondered. Harold regarded him evenly. Yes, things always seem to happen with you. He peered over his glasses at Johnny, who wondered when the boom was going to be lowered. He wished his father would hurry up and get it over with. He just wanted to go inside and try to sleep. Harold stiffened and said, Well, at any rate, it seems you are a hero again. Johnny blinked and shook his head. What? You broke up an illegal moonshine operation. Harold replied patently. You also reunited a father and son, as I understand it. Actually, I feel kind of bad about this still, Johnny said. Professor Mangle was trying to raise money to help Steve. Harold nodded. Yes, but he says he realizes how foolish it was to do that way. He was quite impressed that you stood up to him the way you did. And of course, Deputy Miller is your greatest champion. Realization was slowly dawning on Johnny. Wait. Does this mean I'm not in trouble? I haven't decided yet, Harold replied. I don't know what I'm going to do with you, John. I honestly don't, but while I try to figure it out, how can I punish a hero? He turned and walked back inside the house. Johnny blinked several times, still dazed. This had been one of the strangest days of his life. But even stranger days lay ahead. Epilogue. The next week was a complete blur. Johnny was still so dazed by what had happened to Ben and Professor Mangle, and by his father's reaction to it all, that he could barely concentrate on his schoolwork, and he was still having trouble sleeping. He needed something to clear his mind, so he was extremely happy when, on Sunday, Fiona set his breakfast before him and said, "What do you say we do something fun after church today?" "Like what?" he asked. She sat down beside him. "Well, the weather's beautiful, and I'm thinking it might be the perfect day for a ride. There won't be many more of these lovely days once winter gets loose. Thanksgiving was a few days ago, and I usually hang up my saddle after that. So, are you up for it?" Johnny thought it was the greatest idea he'd ever heard. "Yes, absolutely, I am completely up for it." "Well, don't hold back, John Avery. Tell me how you really feel." Her eyes twinkled. "Eat your breakfast then. We'll need your energy to keep up with me." They'd been racing across the hill for the 10 minutes. Johnny looked over his shoulder to see Fiona at least 4 lengths behind him. "Come on, can't you catch me?" he called back to her. "Wait, hold up, John Avery." Johnny smiled, reining Toby in. He knew Fiona was letting him win their race, but he didn't care. He liked being in the front all the same. "Whoa, Toby," he said. "Let's let the slowpoke catch up." Fiona pulled alongside him. "What's the matter? You're not tired, are you?" Johnny teased. "Me? Tired? Act no," she answered between gasps. Just because my lungs are about to burst. What could make you think I'm tired?" "You sure? Your face looks kind of blue. That's a sign you're not getting enough oxygen." "Not a bit of it. It's the sun playing tricks on your eyes, lad. I'm as fit as a fiddle, and don't you mistake it." "All right, then. Let's race to that tree. Ready?" "Hold on. I may not be tired, but old Earl here needs a moment." Fiona breathed in deeply, letting the air back out in one puff. Then she looked at him and straightened her back. "We'll trot a bit," she declared with a slight nod. Their gait was closer to a walk than a trot, but Johnny decided to say nothing about it. It was enough to be outside with the soft wind blowing through the trees and the damp earth thudding softly under the horse's hooves. Once Fiona had regained her air, she leaned back in the saddle and said, And just when did you become such a good rider, John Avery Whittaker?" That's what I'd like to know. If you aren't careful, you'll put Earl here to shame." Johnny smiled. "I learned from watching you." "I don't see how you could do that unless you have eyes in the back of your head. You're always in front of me." They both laughed a bit, and as they quietly sauntered on, Johnny realized that Fiona had become more than a stepmother to him. She'd become his mother. Not that she could ever replace Janeth. She couldn't do that, nor did she want to. She'd said as much many times over the years. But for all the effort Johnny once put into keeping Fiona at arm's length, he now found his arm getting shorter all the time. With the tension going between him and his dad, it was comforting having Fiona around. He had the sudden urge to tell Fiona about the journal and the cloth and ask whether she thought the cloth could have healing powers. He thought he could trust her, of all people. Then an idea occurred to him. Fiona? Yes, lad? Do you remember back in Scotland, after you married Father, he bought you that really pretty dress? Of course. It was my wedding dress. Such a pity. I had to throw it away because the dog spilled a bowl full of chocolate cake batter all over it. Johnny hesitated. Yeah, well, the dog didn't spill it. I did. Fiona didn't flinch at the news, but simply responded, You did? Well, why did you do that? I don't know. Well, why are you telling me about it now? I guess because I wanted you to know that I'm really sorry about it. I shouldn't have done it. And I wouldn't have if I'd known how nice you are. Johnny waited for her response. Would she be upset? Would she pull away? Knowing her reaction to this question would help him decide whether he could open up about the more important question at hand. Her reaction surprised him. Her lips pursed, and she looked over at him and said, I appreciate your honesty, John Avery, even if it is a bit late, but would it disappoint you too much if I told you I always knew you did it? You did? A dimple smile formed on his face. The dog was smart, but not even he could make handprints. Johnny wasn't one to blush, but he did then. Why didn't you ever say anything? I suppose I figured you'd been through enough with your mother dying and me coming in. They rode on in silence. Johnny thought of Janeth. Even though he was young when his mother died, he never quite escaped the pain of her passing. The effect of it seemed to sear itself on his soul, making the slightest recollection of it as painful as the day it happened. Fiona must have guessed what he was thinking. She rode up beside him and touched his arm. Things have been pretty rough on you, I know, she said. But the thing is to remember that God has a purpose in it all. You might not be able to see it. In fact, you may never be able to see it. But trust me. No. Trust Him. He does have a purpose for it all. Johnny sighed. He had heard such words before, and they seemed to him to be the things people said when they didn't have a good answer. If you say so, he responded. Fiona reined in her horse. Johnny followed suit. Not because I say so, she said, because it's true. Johnny didn't want to be disrespectful, but he did want to be honest with her. It's just kind of hard to believe when he takes your mother away, he said quietly. I mean, you can't know how it feels because you haven't had anything taken away from you. He could tell his comment struck her. She looked down at the reins in her hand and took a deep breath. You're right, John Avery. I haven't. But I've seen God at work in those who have, even though bad things happened to them, they knew that God was still there, loving and caring for them. She raised her eyes, looking into the sky as the soft wind caressed their faces. "We must have faith," she said. She continued simply. "If we put our faith in God, He'll never fail us. Never." Then she turned her gaze to him, looking gently into his eyes. "I want you to always remember that, okay?" Johnny shrugged. "I guess." "In fact," Fiona said as with an impish grin formed over her face, "I want you to think about that while I'm raising you to the tree, to that great tree." And with a kick to the haunches of her horse, she leapt into a gallop. Johnny scowled. "Hey, no fair!" He spurred his horse after her. They raced across the field, Fiona in the lead, but Johnny gained on her. The great tree had become the finishing line for their races. The huge oak looked to be 100 years old, massive in height and impressive in girth. After their races, they would stop and lie down beneath it, surveying the clouds and pondering the questions of life. It had become his favorite tree, and he would not let Fiona beat him to it. He spurred his horse mercilessly. "You cheated!" he called out to her. "Posh!" She laughed, looking back at him. "Can't you catch me, lad? Or are you getting tired, are ye?" At that moment, Johnny saw what Fiona did not. She had topped the rise and had apparently forgotten about the long, thick branches of a beautifully shaped elm tree that stretched across the path. The branch hung low enough to require anyone on horseback to duck under its massive sprawl. "Look out!" Johnny screamed. But it was too late. Fiona had barely turned around when the branch met her full force directly on the forehead. Her scream was cut off as her forehead snapped back, and her body flew off the horse as she tumbled to the ground. "Fiona!" An hour later, Fiona awoke. "Harold?" she whispered groggily. "Shh, I'm right here." "I had the most real dream. I was riding with John Avery." "That was no dream. You were riding. Apparently you had a little run-in with the branch of an elm." "Oh, yes. Dumb place to put the tree. In the middle of a forest." She smiled. "Where's Johnny?" "I'm here," Johnny announced. "I'm so glad you're all right. When I saw you sprawled on the ground and you didn't wake up." "How did I get back home?" she asked. "Johnny rode back to get me," Harold explained. "I drove the truck." "Out there? How did you manage that with no roads?" "Well, let's just say the truck will need a bit of servicing." "We were worried about you, Mommy," Charlie said in a small voice. "No need to worry, love. We were going to take you to the hospital," Johnny said. But Doc Willis is always home on Sundays, and he lives a few blocks away. I was just leaving to get him." "Nonsense," Fiona said. "Don't bother the man on the Sabbath. I'm fine, aside from a little headache." She moved to stand. "I'd better get supper on the table." Harold stopped her, saying, "No, you must lie here and rest for a bit." "I told you I'm fine," she protested. "It's late. You must be all starving." Charlie fairly hid behind her father, her eyes wide with fear. "It's not very late," she squeaked timidly. "Of course it is, Charlie," Fiona said. "Why, it's so dark in here, you can barely see a hand in front of your face," she sighed. "I must have been out cold for hours." Johnny and Harold looked at each other. The room was drenched in light from the afternoon sun. In fact, it was so bright that Johnny had to move out of the glare reflecting off the mirror in the burnou. Johnny leaned closer, looking into Fiona's eyes. The whites of both were not white, but all but blood red from an internal hemorrhage. Her pupils were also oddly dialed. One was as large as a cat's eye in the dark. The other not quite so big, but still more than he would expect in a room this bright. Harold lifted his hand in front of Fiona's face, all 5 fingers stretched out. "Fiona, how many fingers am I holding up?" he asked. She frowned. "Harold, have you gone daft?" she just said. "I just said it was so dark in here that you couldn't see your hand," she sighed. "John Avery, turn on some lights, child." Johnny didn't know what to do. Fear began to rise with him. "But, Dad?" Johnny saw the look of concern etched on his father's brow. His jaw clenched the same way it had when Johnny's mother got sick with the fever that eventually took her life. "John, run and get Doc Willis," Harold commanded, fighting to control his voice. Then, looking right at him, he mouthed the word, "Hurry." So Fiona and Charlie couldn't hear. "Yes, sir," Johnny whispered. He could barely breathe for the thought of what seemed to have happened. "Run," he told himself. "Run as fast as you can. And don't let your mind think of anything else but running even faster." Johnny and Charlie waited outside on the porch while the doctor examined Fiona. Charlie kept asking questions about the accident, but Johnny kept wishing she would just be quiet. The evening sun had faded below the horizon, and he shivered without its warmth. He began to feel hungry, but he quickly regretted the thought of even caring about food at a time like this. After what seemed like forever, Harold and Doc Willis walked out of the house. "Thanks for coming, Doc," Harold said softly. The doctor put on his hat and smiled sympathetically. "It's my job," he replied. "I'll check back in on her in a few days. It may be that internal swelling is the cause of her loss of sight. If so, once it subsides, her sight should return." He put his hand on Harold's shoulder. I know things seem bleak right now, but give it some time. That's the best we can do." Doc Willis shook Harold's hand and turned and nodded at Johnny and Charlie and stepped from the porch.
"Daddy?"
Charlie asked tearfully.
Is Mommy going to see again?"
"I don't know, honey," came the answer. "I don't know." Johnny's mind seemed to turn as dark and cloudy as the night. And with the darkness came a fear of what might lie awaiting for him in the dark. His heart raced, his stomach churned. Was it my fault? He thought. I should have been in front of her. His mind replayed the moment of the accident, but this time his horse's hooves struck the mud, and no matter how much he kicked his heels into the horse's haunches or urged him on, the horse went slower, and then Janet rode faster. Wait. Was it Janeth or Fiona? We're in Scotland, right?